Hello and welcome to this lecture on animal nutrition. This lecture is entitled Animal Nutrition, the Digestive System, and it's based on chapter 47 in Raven et al. 10th edition biology, which is called the Digestive System. Digestive system is unquestionably fascinating for a variety of reasons, but it's interesting because of the fact that this is the point at which animals convert things that aren't them into them, right? So they convert material outside of themselves into themselves, and also how they power their own bodies and go about living. If you've been working in POB2, you will notice that this tail sticking out of this grouper's mouth looks very similar to an animal you dissected earlier in lab. So this is the end of a dogfish here becoming, at this point, grouper. The other thing that I'm going to post in this lab is a number of lectures, crash course lectures, I should say, that are also available on the digestive system because they're excellent coverage of the topic and would also be worth your time if you have a chance to watch them. One of the important elements here as we get started on the digestive system is I want you to understand how digestive systems evolved, and we've actually already talked about this to a degree. Also, we're going to go through the digestive system in parts, and we're going to go through each organ in the system. So I want you to be able to describe how material goes from outside the body into the body and gets used, and how it's broken down. And there's quite a bit of hormonal elements control of the digestive system. I'm not necessarily interested in you memorizing all those hormonal elements, but it would be good to review them, especially the ones that relate to the pancreas. And you should, at the end of this, begin to understand what basal metabolic rate is and why it matters. All right. Digestion and, of course, eating has been happening for a long time. Here's a great example of a fish that died while literally eating another one and became fossilized, right? So this is certainly an old thing. And we think about eating all the time, and it happens pretty much constantly. Animals are constantly eating other animals. Now, if you remember back to the diversity chapters that we discussed when we talked about how do these animal organisms actually evolve, I talked about some organisms that were very basal, in this case the cnidarians, which had only one entry into their body. It was a mouth or an anus. So I should say it's mouth and an anus in that sense. So food would come in, it would be digested, and then it would be expelled. As a result, all of the cells that line the digestive areas had to be able to digest everything and had to be exposed to every type of enzyme that the digestive system might use. So there's very little specialization. Ultimately, though, this is not the most efficient way to go about digesting food, although it works fine in many cases. The most efficient way would be to pass that along a single tube. And this is what we see in the vast majority of other animals, is the evolution of a tube inside of a tube. And within that tube now, because there are different locations along it, you don't need to expose the entire tube to all of the same enzymes, but you can actually split it up so that the tube is exposed to certain kinds as you move through it. And this is exactly what we see in animal bodies as they evolve this more complex anatomy. You see that the tube, which is now differentiated into parts, is common throughout the animal kingdom, and the parts each do something slightly different. Here's a nematode here below this, this cnidarian. It has a more complex digestive system. All right, so let's start with how we actually get from outside to the inside. Okay, so I just want to be clear as we start this that your book covers this in sort of a slapdash fashion and is, as I would describe it, all over the place. It's really unfocused. The important thing I do want you to understand is food is modified before digestion by the organism as it's brought in. This is almost universally true. There's some sort of movement of material into the body and it has to change as it moves in. In mammals, and this is what your book is really excited about, it's done with very specialized teeth. That's very cool. There are actually different types of teeth in a mammal's mouth. This is only true of mammals. All other organisms either have one set of teeth or no teeth at all, in which case there's really no differentiation across the mouth, living animals, I should say. And there's actually different chambers that are, or organ systems and chambers within this body as they move them in different members. But for the purposes of bringing things in, there is usually a physical breaking of material as it's brought into the body. Just to convince you that that is in fact the case, on your left, what you're looking at is, well, again, I'm going to put this in quotes, the word fish here. You can see that catfish and gar, while they do have teeth, they're all the same tooth. Now they may be different sizes, but they're laid down on the exact same plan. It's the same tooth, just different sizes. Look at here at reptiles, in quotes. You can see that again, the same tooth. And you can also see that iguanas can grow new teeth, which is not surprising because a lot of organisms can. Now, if you compare that to mammals, which you look at, let's say, on that little area that says mammals in panel B and in panel C, what you see is there's all kinds of teeth. And if you look to the right here on this phylogeny, what you see is that mammal teeth are very diverse even within the mouth. So mammals have teeth that are placed in different locations and they do different things. The phylogeny on the right I really like because it shows how a primitive basal insectivore, that tooth morphology is modified and ultimately gives rise to these hugely diverse ranges of morphology that we see. And in fact, in some cases, the complete loss of teeth, but always in mammals, very modified teeth. And again, this is for mammals only. I know that we focused a lot on humans. Humans also have very different teeth across their mouth, like other mammals. But I just want to stress that the book really gets excited about this. That's wonderful, but we need to be clear it's just one group of animals. All right, so let's talk about the digestive system as it concerns humans. Now, there are many approaches to building a digestive system. The human system is one of those. It is relatively similar to many others. It is easy to understand because you've probably seen it to some degree before. It does not have some of the complexity that some of the other systems have, but we're going to spend some time talking about the human system. All right. In general, what we're going to see in animals is that there's going to be some mouth where things come in. I'm going to change this to red so we can see it. There'll be a mouth or area where food will come in. That's going to pass through some tube into a storage location, here the stomach. There's going to be a modification of that food, and then it's going to be passed into another area where it's going to the small intestine where it's going to be digested. There are going to be members that are be secreting a lot of materials like enzymes into that area. Finally, that food's going to move to an exit area where it will be stored as its whatever I should say is leftovers be stored, and the water will be extracted, and then it will be expelled from the body. And as a general rule, this is a good ground plan for how digestive systems are set up. It is not, again, the only one. Okay, and we're going to start here with the entry point. All right, so one of the most important elements, besides the teeth, which we've just talked a little bit about, is that saliva be secreted into the mouth. And so saliva is going to be really important to help lubricate food and break it down so that it can both be the digestion process can partially start, but also so they can move through the throat. Think about this. If you were to pass a lot of food down your throat without any lubrication, how painful that would be, right? So if you've ever eaten if you've ever done one of these food challenges where you eat some either very dry food or a lot of it very quickly, or you take a big mouthful of some material and then try to eat it without drinking any water, you'll begin to realize that this is a real problem. So saliva is really important. And saliva, by and large, is primarily water, although of course there are proteins in it, which will help coat the food. And again, it will primarily be used as lubrication, but it also does a small amount of digestion, and it will help things like your taste buds taste food as it moves to the body. And then many animals will also have something like a tongue, obviously humans do, and that tongue will be used often to manipulate food. It can help mix the food, it can move the food, it can block the throat, right? There's lots of things that the tongue can do, and it also helps to swallow the food ultimately by creating a sealed chamber for it to be moved down. Now, one of the problems that humans face, and this is a problem that is associated with modifying a fish body, is that the air passageways are connected to the throat. And that means as food moves down from the mouth, it can actually be sucked in to the respiratory surfaces. And when that happens, you can actually be in a situation where you can't breathe because there's food blocking your respiratory surface. So the Heimlich maneuver is a useful way to unblock that, right? So if you see someone showing this face and they can't talk and their face starts to become discolored, like a bluish color, it's time for you to get behind them, put your hand in a fist over their stomach and push and pump really hard up against their diaphragm to expel the material that's in their mouth. This is a very simple thing to do, but it's very, very useful in preventing people from choking to death. And actually, people do choke to death on food. It is not that rare, and animals do regularly die from ingesting food that's too large and it obstructs their air passageway. And again, this is a modified fish body. In a fish body, where the gills are in line with the incoming food structure, it's very difficult for food to get trapped and actually block the gills from respiring. And so this is not an issue. But when the two chambers have to be in line with each other, but one is now only has a small entrance hole, which would be down to the trachea and into the lungs, and that can be blocked, this becomes a real issue. Okay, and so the food, as it moves down the esophagus, so if it makes it past that trachea, there will be a series of circular muscles which will go through what's called peristalsis, and they will contract in a wave pattern. And as they do that, the food will move down. So the pattern is such, there will be contraction up at the top by these green arrows. That contraction will increase, so there will be a contraction like this, and then it will not contract right there. And that wave will continue to move forward. And then as the food gets down there, what will happen is the back of the contracted muscles will start to relax, and then they'll be ready for more food to come in. Peristalsis is very common in the digestive system. It is often involuntary. So there are parts of it that are voluntary, but a lot of it will be involuntary, especially as we get into the small intestine. The first place now that food is going to end up is this location called the stomach. So let's take a look at that. Here, just to remind you what we're dealing with, the stomach is located immediately after the esophagus. Let's take a look at this thing here. This is called the stomach. This looks like most stomachs that you will see. The stomach actually does have a lot of these little wrinkly bits on it, and that's true as long as there's no food in it. But when the food actually enters the stomach, those little wrinkly bits are just collapsed tissue, and the stomach will easily be able to expand to accommodate lots of food. So one of the big things that the stomach does is simply stores food. So if you can imagine, you've evolved a system now where you can collect food from the outside. You don't actually need to eat it yet, right? But you can keep it away from competitors. So that's a real advantage. So there'll be the ability to store it, although it'll be temporary. Then you're going to crush it with a bunch of acids. So you're going to release all sorts of hydrochloric acid onto this to kill bacteria, to kill invaders, and to also help start to break things down. The stomach is also pretty muscular and it will do a lot of contracting, so it's going to start the process of mixing and crushing that food a little bit more. And there's a small amount of actually removal of material from this into the body, so what we call eating it, right? So there's nutrient extraction, although it's very, very limited. And if you did not have a stomach for nutrient extraction, you would have no problem sustaining your body with nutrients. But for the purpose of understanding and being fair, yes, there are some nutrients that are removed in the stomach. Two of the big things that the stomach secretes are HCl and pepsin. Pepsin is going to be really important to break down proteins. And again, that's going to be really helpful in a couple of ways. One, it's going to get digestion started for real. You're going to start to break up amino acids and have them available as you move into the small intestine. And two, if you have invaders arriving, they're going to have to be able to survive being attacked by pepsin. So the removal of, or the attack from a protein destroying enzyme. Both of those are very, very useful features to have available to you in the stomach to help, again, protect you. Now, a number of organisms, of course, have evolved to bypass the stomach systems, and in fact, some of the parasites that are found in animals rely on HCl and pepsin to break down protective barriers so that by the time they enter the small intestine, they're unsheathed and ready to be entered. They can actually enter the small intestine and begin to feed. In fact, if they were to bypass the stomach entirely, they wouldn't successfully colonize the small intestine. But food has to go through the stomach, so there's no way that's going to happen. All right, and just to give you an example of the difference between stomachs that are full and not full, on the left here is a picture of a stomach. That green area is the stomach with quite a bit of food in it. And on the right is a picture of a stomach filled with food from a competitive eater. The picture on the right is taking up almost the entire abdominal cavity. Just to be clear, this is not, or I'm not recommending this. This is not safe. There are issues associated with overexpanding the stomach and potential leakage, as well as damage caused to other organs by compression. If your stomach is regularly inflated like this, right? This is not a system that has generally evolved to hold on to that much food. But the picture on the left where the stomach is fairly enlarged, but is resting comfortably within that abdominal cavity, that is not uncommon. The other thing you'll see is the stomach is enlarged on the left is actually putting pressure up against the lung. You can definitely see that on the picture on the right. And so if you've eaten a lot of food at one sitting, sometimes people will say it's hard to breathe. They're absolutely right. One of their lungs is not fully inflating, and so they're getting a response that they're not getting as much oxygen per breath. And so they feel like it's hard to breathe, and that is in fact the case. All right, so let's move from the stomach now. We've started the digestive process for real. Let's talk about the small intestine. The small intestine is really where the business of digestion goes on in animals. It's going to be important for nutrient absorption. The three big ones it's going to be involved in are the removal of proteins, the removal of starches, that is sugars, and the removal of fats. Okay. One of the things that's going to first happen as material enters the small intestine is the small intestine is not acidic. And so the fat is, or the acid is neutralized as it comes in. So all that acid coming in from the stomach is immediately neutralized. The pH is brought more towards a neutral setting. At that point, the small intestine begins to really rapidly extract nutrients from the food. And one of the ways it does that is by having all these what are called villi along it, right? So here's a cutaway of a small intestine. You can see all these little what look like fingers, and that's what the villi mean, poking out. And if you zoom in, and we will zoom in on those each little finger, they're also covered in even smaller fingers, right? Tons and tons of these. So the surface area of the small intestine is absolutely staggering. And the goal here is to be able to extract every little bit of nutrient from the food that comes in. And the small intestine is very, very good at that. Remember when I said that arteries lead to capillaries, capillaries lead to veins, and veins ultimately lead back to the heart? Well, that wasn't entirely the case, at least in this one case. In the digestive system, arteries lead to capillaries, capillaries lead to veins, veins lead to capillaries, and capillaries lead back to veins, which go back to the heart. And that's the case for the small intestine to the liver. In the hepatic portal vein, actually, arteries bring fresh blood down to the small intestine, passes through capillaries that surround the small intestine, and then the blood travels through a vein, and you would expect that to dump right back into the circulatory system, but it actually travels slowly up to the liver, goes through another series of capillaries, and then back out. And there's an importance to this, and you should think about why that is the case. What's also important to understand, this is very slow because you're going through a very low pressure system with capillaries that surround it, both on the incoming and outgoing side. And so the movement of blood from the small intestine to the liver is relatively low paced compared to some of the higher pressure systems we've seen. So again, think about why this in fact is the case. Why does blood go from the small intestine to the liver first and not just directly back to the body? And the blood that's going from the small intestine to the liver is primarily transporting two things now. Amino acids, because the proteins have been broken down and the small intestine has absorbed them, and sugars, because the starches have been broken down and the small intestine has absorbed them and is sending it directly to the liver. It's actually not transporting the fats, even though it's absorbing them, because the fats are actually going into the lymph. And so if you were to tap someone's lymph vessels after they've eaten a very fatty meal, you could actually see that fat, those little fat globules moving in the lymph nodes. All right, so we'll return to that question, but let's move forward now. Let's talk about the large intestine. So we talked now about how food, most of the resources are extracted from food. Let's talk about how we finish it off and then where it gets stored before it's expelled. The large intestine is the last little bit here, and the big important elements for the body are that you recover the water that has been lost to the food or that is contained within the food, recover vitamins and minerals, and that you can store things for some period of time, right? It's very useful to be able to store food for some short period of time before it's expelled. You don't want to store it for a long period of time, but you do need to be able to store it, especially in the case of predators, which want to store their feces away from places where their prey might know where they're located. So predators often poop in a centralized location or remove information from prey about where they're actually living. And then the other important element to understand here is, although we make a fair amount of feces every day, feces are not primarily the food we've eaten, though there is, of course, bits of the food that we haven't broken down in it, but it actually is mostly bacteria. And the large intestine is a really good place to let bacteria work on the food, break down any last little bits that they can, right? If you're lucky, you'll get to access some of that energy, but minimally, it will also help to move and process that food. All right, so when you look at feces, don't think, wow, look at all that food being wasted. The vast majority of the energy is being extracted. But you can think, wow, that's a lot of bacterial production that's coming out of a human body, or out of any body, really. The book is going to spend a long time talking about adaptations to digestive systems. And what I want you to understand is that there's some generally common themes to this. One of the problems that all animals face is that if they could keep in contact with the food longer, or if they could attack it at a more rapid rate, then they would get more material out of that. And that's especially true of herbivores, which deal with very recalcitrant food, food that's very, very difficult to break down. And one of the things that has evolved over and over again is fermentation, which is you bring in food and you ferment it and let bacteria work on it. And in this case, you let that happen very, very early. As opposed to waiting until you get to the large intestine, you do it right away and help bacteria do the work for you. Now, this is going to cost you some energy, of course. The bacteria are going to go about making their business and they're going to extract energy. But it may free up a lot of energy at the same time too. And so for herbivores, the cost is very, very low. It's worthwhile. For things like carnivores, you wouldn't want bacteria breaking the food down. It's going to be relatively simple to digest. So that carnivores do not rely on what we call foregut fermentation. But herbivores, which break down things like leaf material, do rely on it in many, many cases. In the top right picture is a ruminant stomach. And what you can see from that is that it's broken into lots of different chambers. And these lots of different chambers are actually useful for helping to create fermentation areas. It's also important to understand this is just one type of foregut fermentation. Okay, so ruminants are a good example of fermentation in animals, foregut fermentation in animals, but they're certainly not the only one. This is not the only system that has evolved. Numerous herbivores have clearly evolved ways to ferment food as it comes in, and many of those are probably extinct at this point. So we don't necessarily know how every single herbivore has ever evolved these systems, but you can see that there's a lot of complexity here, and this is kind of the complexity that you need to do this sort of thing. You need to be able to bring food in, but store it for a really long time and let bacteria work on it for hours before you can move it on to other locations to be attacked. The other thing that happens is that there's actually additional fermentation that occur in some animals. So in many animals, they have what's called a cecum, which is located after the small intestine and really sort of before the large intestine. And this is, again, another fermentation chamber. Again, another chance to break apart food before you send it on to be extracted again. And so there's a lot of modifications. This is drastically increases the time which food is attacked, right? And so ultimately it provides an opportunity to extract more resources. Another option, if you don't have room for these really complex systems, is to increase the literal contact time you have with the food. And this is simple to do in principle, right? Okay, well, just make your intestinal system really, really, really long. You can clearly see that in some of the herbivore over here, the deer. Let me circle that. Look at how long this intestinal system is. Like here in this picture, they've actually coiled some of it, right? Compare that to, say, the fox, which is very, very short. The rabbit has also got a very long digestive system, but the problem is the digestive system of the rabbit is pretty constrained by the size of the rabbit. The rabbit's not got an infinitely large body it can fill up with long guts. So there is, in fact, also other ways to do this. You can increase the length of the system, but you could also just eat the food over and over again, right? And so rabbits eat their own feces, and this is fairly common in animals called coprophagy, where you poop and then you eat some of those feces so that it goes back through the system, effectively doubling the length of your gut, right? And in some ways, providing you an opportunity to recover more energy. This is, again, a really useful way to try to extract difficult to consume resources. And animals like insectivores, which are carnivorous, and true carnivores like we think of them, eating other animals. This is completely unnecessary. You'll get all the resources you need by one passage through the gut, and the gut doesn't even have to be that long. In addition to those organs, which we've now covered, there's a couple other really important ones in here. One, of course, is the liver. Liver is a really large organ. It sits sort of on top of the stomach, in and around the center of the abdominal region. It also has underneath it a bright green thing called a gallbladder. It is, in fact, this very green color, and it helps to metabolize materials. And so one of the important elements of those capillary beds being shared, the hepatic portal vein, is that you really want materials to go to the liver first before you move it out to the body. Imagine that you ate something with a potential poison in it. Send it to the liver and allow the liver to metabolize it. At least don't expose the body to it. Just let some of the cells work on it and see if they can break it down. That's exactly what livers do. You'll often hear people say that the livers detoxify food. They don't detoxify food. They metabolize substances that reach them. And so if there's a toxic substance that can be metabolized, they will metabolize it. Now, that means that some substances which are toxic to your cells can be broken down in the liver, although it will cause damage to the liver, will largely be constrained to the liver. There are some substances which the liver cannot break down. Those will go out to the body and it will damage the body universally. All right, so just to be clear, I don't want you to use the words detoxify. You're budding biologists, you should use the word metabolizes, and you should understand what that means. The liver also produces this substance called gall. Gall is stored in the gallbladder, and it helps in the process of digestion. You can have a gallbladder removed, although if you do have a gallbladder removed, what you'll find is that you need to eat frequent small meals as opposed to sitting down to single large meals, because without the ability to store lots of gall, you'll need to have it released sort of continuously, and you should try to keep pace with the food that's entering the system in a sort of continuous fashion. The liver is also important in the process of storing glucose as glycogen, so it's going to help store materials for long periods of time, and it's going to be informed about that, as you know, from the pancreas, and you should know the hormone that tells the liver to do that. In addition to the liver, there's also this really important organ which we've actually already covered, but I'll put it back here, and in fact I'm going to reuse the exact same slide I did when we talked about hormones. But this thing called the pancreas. The pancreas is going to make a lot of enzymes, and it's going to be in charge of helping to deacidify, so to increase the pH of material exiting from the stomach. It's also going to release enzymes that are going to help break down materials and also to emulsify fats. And the other things that it's really important for is it's releasing hormones in the body related to the taking up of glucose, which is insulin, and the breakdown of glycogen into glucose, that is glucogen. Okay, so again, this is a reminder. We've actually already covered this, but I wanted to point out it's a really critical component of the digestive system. The other thing that we should talk about is that there are essential nutrients. There are a number of nutrients which bodies cannot make. This varies in different animals, but they have to be collected from food then. That's what an essential nutrient is. Sometimes it's amino acids. Sometimes it's vitamins. Here's a picture of some what are called vitamins on the right. And also, in addition to that, fatty acids, right? Many fatty acids you have to eat. Hence the reason people are like, oh, saltwater fish are so good for you because they have certain fatty acids in it. That is a little bit true. There are fatty acids you can't get except by eating other animals. Many of those fatty acids are contained in other organisms. So you don't have to worry about eating enough tuna to survive, right? Humans can eat lots of different things and survive. But there are plenty of essential nutrients. Essential nutrients are no more than they can't be made by the body, so the body relies on some incoming material for that. I'd like to point out that this thing down here, I just realized this structure here is wrong. It shouldn't be HC3, it should be CH3. All right, and that's all for the nutrients and animal digestion. And actually, that's all for my lectures for this semester. So I will not be posting any more for this semester in POB2, but I look forward to your questions in lecture.